welcome to this Friday edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles, and I am your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas. Got a very, very packed and exciting show for you today. We have a guest, Pedro Rios of American Friends Service Committee, is going to be joining our San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera, in just a moment for a very in-depth interview on what they are seeing over on their side of the border. But first, let's take a look at some of the headlines making news across the entire border, starting in California, with California Governor Gavin Newsom asking the federal government to disclose how much taxpayer money has been used by the Trump administration for the controversial deployment of the National Guard in Los Angeles earlier this year. Now, the governor's office has filed a Freedom of Information Act request, or a FOIA, to obtain records from the Department of Defense. The FOIA asked for the cost of the June 2025 mobilization, which Newsom has repeatedly called an illegal militarization of Los Angeles. Now, according to prior congressional testimony, Pentagon staff estimated that the deployment could cost up to $134 million. Newsom's office now wants to confirm those numbers and make them public. In other news, a lawsuit has been filed in Louisiana accusing U.S. immigration officials of unlawfully deporting 3 U.S. citizen children, including a 4-year-old with stage 4 kidney cancer. The lawsuit, which says this is the lawsuit which says those children were deported in April along with their parents who are not U.S. citizens. This is the law, without due process and parental consent or access to legal counsel. The 39-page suit alleges ICE agents in Louisiana detained the families during routine immigration checks, denied them contact with lawyers and family, and then deported the family to Honduras 3 days later. The 4-year-old was undergoing life-saving cancer treatment at a New Orleans Children's Hospital. Also happening today, a federal judge is set to hear a Trump administration request to end a long-standing policy on protections for immigrant children in federal custody. It's called the Flores Settlement, and that limits how long Customs and Border Protection can hold immigrant children and requires safe conditions. Now, advocates argue the protections are necessary and have submitted accounts of poor conditions in detention centers. The Trump administration says conditions have improved since the settlement was formalized back in 1997. But advocates for the children say the government is holding children beyond the time limits set out in that agreement. A hearing is set for today in Los Angeles, so make sure to check out borderreport.com. We'll have the latest on that a little as it happens. Time now to bring in our San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera, and our guest, Mr. Pedro Rios of American Friends Service Committee. Hey, Sal.
Hi, Rudy. Thank you. And before we go any further, a little disclaimer. If your politics tend to bend towards the right, or you are perhaps a big supporter of President Trump's border policies, you may not agree with everything you're about to hear, but I think it's worth your while to see and listen to other perspectives of what is happening along the border. So I think this next 25 minutes or so will definitely be worth your while if you just hang with us and listen to our guest, Pedro Rios, is about to talk about. Pedro, first of all, why don't you tell us about what the American Friends Service Committee is and what it does for people, not just migrants along the southern border?
Thank you, Salvador. Yeah, the American Friends Service Committee is a Quaker organization that started in 1917 with providing youth alternatives to war. It's based on the principles of a peace church, a historic church that moves with the idea that everyone is blessed with being that of God, and as such should be provided with certain treatment based on justice. And the work expands not only domestically in the United States, but also around the world. And it's a lot of the work is based on how to uphold basic dignity for people that might be in vulnerable situations. And in San Diego, since 1977, the U.S. Mexico border program has been working with migrant and border communities on issues that might be around immigration, enforcement, and generally human rights.
And we saw you doing that, especially a year ago, 2 years ago, when it was really crowded, well, lack of a better term, crowded along the border, as you saw hundreds and hundreds of migrants arriving at the border between San Diego and Tijuana. Take us back to those days and what it was like as you saw this sea of humanity, migrants seeking a better life for themselves.
There were many migrants, as you say, that were crossing into the United States through various areas, and a lot of it was coordinated, where they would pay smugglers, and so smuggling networks were exploiting some of the areas along the border areas, where people were crossing through into the U.S. But the intention for most of them was to make an asylum claim, and so they would turn themselves in to Border Patrol agents, and Border Patrol agents then would force them to remain in areas that we called open air detention sites. And some of the footage that you're seeing is from one known as Whiskey 8. And Whiskey 8 was where our team with the American Friends Service Committee, together with other organizations, were providing food, water, and other types of aid during a time when Border Patrol was not providing that type of assistance, which they were obligated to do so under something called the TEDS requirements. And these are standards that ensure how people should be treated when they are under custody of Border Patrol. And the whole premise here was that question: at what point do migrants who are making an asylum claim become under the custody of border agents? And we allege that at the point that Border Patrol was telling people that they had to remain at these sites, that in fact that's when custody began.
Okay. Tell us about the undertaking to provide water and food and even phone chargers to thousands of people in what seemed like months on end. What was it like for you trying to help these folks?
It was extremely difficult under the circumstances that we found ourselves in. The site that we were at, as I mentioned, Whiskey 8, was a site where we were divided by the secondary border wall. This is a 30-foot border wall that prevented us to have direct access with migrants who were told to remain there. And through the slats of the border wall, we provided water and food and other types of aid. There were people that were arriving with some serious injuries, deep lacerations from cuts that occurred when they went through the concertina wire. There were people that had fallen from the border wall and arrived with broken ankles or broken arms. There were people that were suffering from dehydration because they remained at this place for hours, and in some cases up to 5 days. And so for us, we saw the very basic necessity of providing these basic items: food, water, aid, phone chargers, so that they could contact their family members, especially during cases where Border Patrol would separate the men from the rest of their family members. And then sometimes we did experience some level of aggression by some of the Border Patrol agents who did not necessarily like for us to be feeding people who were in dire conditions.
What was it like? Because eventually Border Patrol did come around and they gave you some space and perhaps were open to you helping out. You remember when that happened, and perhaps what was the point where they decided that it was better for you to help these folks than them having to do it?
I believe what really led to that moment was the attention that was provided to Whiskey from members of the media that arrived and were filming what was taking place, from other organizations that were willing to support, even neighbors from nearby communities that would arrive and provide food as well. And even government officials, from the local to some of the federals who arrived, weren't doing much, but at least their presence helped to calm the tension that was in the area. And so we propped up a couple of tents and stored our supplies there. And at that point, became, I believe it was almost a 2-year venture of having a constant presence there, and ensuring that people were receiving the basic necessities that they needed in order to remain there for the duration that many of them were there for.
And I remember talking to people from all over the world, as you did, I'm sure. We couldn't help have conversations with these folks, and they would tell you where they were from and where they were headed. And tell us why. A lot of people misunderstood and they started calling them illegal, unlawful. But I remember you telling me that these people were under the legal right to pursue amnesty. Talk a little bit about that and why some people perhaps did not get the reason, or perhaps saw them as criminals or anything less than just people seeking a better life for themselves or their children.
Yeah, that's a great question because it's important to establish that everyone has the right to seek asylum and that the U.S. is a signatory and it's also protected under the Constitution that people seeking asylum would be afforded the opportunity to do so. And these individuals that were crossing into the U.S., a space between the primary and the secondary border wall, turning themselves into border agents because they were fearing returning to their home countries. And many of them would state that. And they would describe conditions that were extremely horrendous. I remember the case of a 12-year-old boy from Mexico who was forced to remain locked up in a cage when he was held by cartels, and he escaped. And at that moment, with whatever they can gain, the mom took him and they made their way north. And so there were some really hardship stories here that we were learning about, and where people were not arriving to the United States with the intention of exploiting the country, which we hear a lot of times, and people are criminalized in that way, but it's because out of necessity, they needed to seek safety, and the U.S. had been seen by many as the beacon of a place that would receive people and offer them hope for their futures and for the future of their families.
Now, while you were providing water and other necessities, there were others who were taking advantage of the migrants. I remember doing stories about how people were preying on these folks, selling them like $40 pizzas and bringing them hamburgers that were being charged like, $20. Talk about the abuses that you saw, people who took advantage of these poor souls at the border.
There were various experiences that people had depending on where they were arriving to in that specific area, especially during the first few months, where people were forced to remain for days at a time without any substance, any real food at that moment. They were trapped between the primary and the secondary border wall, as you can kind of make out during through some of the images. And so, if they were to get closer to the primary border wall, which is abuts the city of Tijuana in Mexico, then they might be able to order food from people who would then bring the food and charge them these extremely high prices for a box of pizza, for instance. And sometimes they would put their financial resources together, various people there, to buy a box of pizza in order to feed several people. But the prices were extremely high. And it was at that moment that we decided to ensure that there's a lot more food that we can provide to the people that were closer to the secondary border wall.
All right. We're talking with Pedro Rios of the American Friends Service Committee. Stay with us because we're going to continue this incredible conversation when we come back. Border Report Live is back in 1 minute. And welcome back to this Friday edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas. And joining me to my right there is our San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera. And to my left, we have Mr. Pedro Rios of the American Friends Service Committee.
Pedro, we were talking about what you saw a few years ago with the masses of people showing up seeking asylum. In June of last year, President Biden signed an executive order making it very difficult to seek asylum. And then President Trump took office in January, and he has made it basically impossible to seek asylum. What are you seeing in terms of the very low, historic lows of numbers of people trying to come to the U.S. for asylum or just simply for immigration purposes?
Yeah, that's correct. And I would preface by saying that the promise of asylum in terms of how the United States considers it has been all but eviscerated. And so asylum isn't necessarily a protected right anymore in the United States. And so what this means is that people that are entering the US in the same way that they might have before no longer can be promised that idea that the US will receive them because of the harshness and of conditions around asylum policies. And so consequently, the number of people that are crossing into the U.S. has dropped extremely low, as you mentioned, Salvador. We are seeing that this has forced many people that are intending to cross into the U.S. to do so in many more dangerous ways, whether it's maritime crossings. And a few months ago, there were two minors, Indian nationals, a boy and a girl that drowned in their attempts to cross into the U.S. using one of these small, what they call panga boats. There are people that are crossing through the desert still, going further east, and where crossing through extremely treacherous terrain, the mountains and the deserts, means that more people will die by exposure to the elements in their attempts to cross into the U.S. So it's become a much harsher endeavor for the fewer number of people that are attempting to enter the U.S.
Now, President Trump and supporters maintain that we don't need any more migrants. A lot of them are criminals, people who are willing to do whatever it takes to enter this country, and not necessarily by good, positive means. So, what do you say to folks who say, let's close the doors, shut the gates? We can't have this invasion of people coming into the U.S. What do you tell those folks? Any way to try and convince them that migrants are a positive for this country and that they are needed to help our economy and in other areas of society?
There are extremely harmful tropes that certain people in politics are using to describe migrant communities. The creation of the what they call criminals, so the creation of a bogeyman or a boogeyman, however you say it, is a real thing that then foments a lot of fear in communities. But when we get down to the nitty gritty, what we begin to find out is that people who are migrants are and have always been members of our communities. They go to church with us. They go send their kids to the same schools that we go to. You know, they're our neighbors, and oftentimes they are members of our families. We are them, they are us. And the creation and othering of people based on false and dangerous narratives on criminality and these ideas of invasion are really not based on reality. And what they tend to do is convince people that don't have a lot of experience in interacting with communities that are primarily migrant communities, then influence their thought processes and might be more likely to support dangerous laws that ultimately will affect everyone, because migrant communities and their contributions to the United States, whether it's cultural, political, economic, are extremely valuable and extremely vital to the well-being and the success of our country.
Both sides of the aisle have said that perhaps we do need immigration reform. What does that mean to you, and how would you describe any sort of reform when it comes to immigration?
The last significant immigration reform that we had was the IRCA bill when President Reagan signed it in the mid 80s, and that led to roughly around 3 million people that were able to adjust their status and become U.S. citizens. And since then, we haven't had a major piece of legislation that reforms immigration laws that allows people to adjust their status. But what we have had an extremely amount of dedication to enforcing immigration laws, to the point where people that are entering the U.S. are much likely to be criminalized, much likely to face harsh enforcement laws that remove them from the country, even though they are valuable members of our communities. And so what I would like to see is immigration reform that is centered on human rights, that is centered on humanitarian support, that's centered on uplifting the human dignity of people that are entering the United States and wishing to do so because they don't have any other options in their lives right now. And I think that is a better prospect for how we would want to grow this country, grow the United States in ways that welcomes people that have so much to contribute to our society.
Do you see it happening or while Mr. Trump is in office?
I don't really see that as being a prospect for us in the next few years. And in fact, I would even say that it's been difficult to get a positive, favorable piece of legislation, even when the Democrats were in power. There are pieces of legislation that have been considered low-hanging fruit. Having those that are under DACA, or what we've called the Dreamers in the past, ensuring that there's a pathway for permanent status for them is just a low-hanging fruit that even with the Democrats in power, we're not able to achieve. And so unless we regroup and recenter the priorities that are based around human rights perspectives, we're going to continue to have policies that are detrimental to human life and place people at greater risk.
Now, one thing that Mr. Trump is very high on is deportations. No secret was made during the campaign. He promised he was going to go and round up people. He did say there would be criminals, deport them, get them out of the country. Now, ICE has become very prevalent in a lot of communities. What are you seeing and hearing from migrants as agents carry on with these deportations, not just in California, but in many other states across the country?
I am hearing a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of just not knowing whether someone will be targeted. And I mean, I've talked to people who have stopped going to work. They're trying to find alternative ways of sending their kids to school without having to expose themselves. And that's, I think, across the board. On the other hand, what I'm also seeing is people that are organizing, people that are creating community networks, people that are making sure that their neighbors are safe. And this is both migrants and non-migrants. And that's an important consideration because while the narrative that the current administration would like to feed the public is people need to live in fear, the alternative perspective that I'm also seeing is that while that fear is a reality, but there's also organizing, there is a reluctance to succumb to that fear, and people are trying to live their lives with dignity in a way that is understanding that the current situation is in some ways unbearable and unsustainable.
What are you hearing in terms of ICE? Who they target, who they go after? Earlier in the live stream, we heard about those children, U.S. citizens in Louisiana, who were arrested. One of the children, a 4-year-old, had kidney cancer and was undergoing treatments in a New Orleans hospital. We heard of the mom or lady dropping off her someone at a school here in Chula Vista, California, and she was arrested outside of the school. We heard of the lady selling tamales in Pacoima up in Los Angeles. She suffered a heart attack during the arrest. How are they pinpointing or deciding on who they're going to target, whether it's workers at a Home Depot or out on the field in Oxnard, California?
I think it goes back to the quotas that ICE has and overall, right? Because it doesn't only include ICE, it also includes Customs and Border Protection, primarily through Border Patrol, and in Southern California through Border Patrol's new chief who's in charge of these operations throughout Southern California. And so if they're attempting to meet the quotas and they're going to try to detain people as quickly as it can without having to use all the tools that they need to apprehend someone. So a lot of the apprehensions are taking place indiscriminately, and Border Patrol has been leading this through their former now El Centro chief, sector chief, Greg Bovino. And these indiscriminate detentions have led to litigation that has told them you have to stop using these racist ways of detaining people. On the other hand, though, we know that ICE tends to use two ways, of using court orders to detain people, and that gets quite complex as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today, but that is all the time we have. This is Pedro Rios of the American Friends Service Committee. Thank you so much for joining us. Very enlightening conversation. We appreciate you being here, sir.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, stay with us because after the break, I have one headline to tell you about and also has to do with lawsuits. This one regarding the so-called alligator Alcatraz, and it just happened today. I'll tell you more about it in 1 minute. And welcome back to Border Report Live. That headline we wanted to tell you about: a federal judge has ordered a temporary halt to construction of an immigration detention center built in the middle of the Florida Everglades. It's known as by this administration as Alligator Alcatraz. Now, attorneys argued that the construction violates environmental laws. Under Thursday's order, the facility can continue to operate and hold detainees for U.S. immigration and customs enforcement. Environmental groups and the Miccosukee tribe have asked a federal judge to issue a preliminary injunction to halt operations and further construction. Really quick, before we go, wanted to remind you to check out our partners at Political Power Ranker. It's a weekly show tracking the movers, shakers, and rule makers in American politics. Nextstar's Director of Political Content, Chris Berg, and Director of Emerson College Polling, Spencer Kimball, break down who's up, who's down in the world of politics based on data. This week, they're focusing on the California governor's race with some new polling from Emerson College. It's so hot, they couldn't drop it until today. So make sure you check it out. You can find more on Political Power Ranker at abc27.com or your local Nextstar station's website. And you can find more of our reporting on borderreport.com as well as every episode. We'll see you Monday.